Welcome to EDFG C5809. This week's focus is on developing your teacher identity. Well, in fact, that's the focus all the time, but this week we're looking at meeting the needs of diverse learners and also continuing our reflection as critically reflective practitioners. The learning intentions this week is for you to continue to explore and understand some of the social, political and cultural contexts, standards and policies of teaching, particularly in the context of reflective practice and student diversity. And also the success criteria is that you will be able to articulate an example of collaborative approaches to teaching and learning and cultivate and engage in a collaborative approach to teaching and learning. You're probably familiar with René Descartes' expression or famous words, "I think, therefore I am." Now, those words were spoken in the 1600s. It's a while ago, but it's nevertheless just as important as ever. And as teachers, we develop our identity by questioning our assumptions, examining our practice and interrogating what directs our action, and then also exploring alternatives. An experience alone is not enough, as you would have seen in that Loffren reading, because it's that scaffolded practice, and both there's also a time sense in respect to this when we explore and reflect on alternative approaches to practice. And it's particularly helpful when we're trying to develop our practice, whether we're pre-service teachers or whether we're experienced teachers or whether we're university lecturers or whatever we are. The idea is still the same, that we explore and reflect and fine-tune our practice. Now, there are three main approaches, if you like, in an anticipatory approach. So we're considering in that we actually need to consider the role of assumptions as we think, okay, what's going to happen? How can we make this happen? And also tapping into previous examples of approaches we might have used or we've seen others use in order to develop our practice for something we're about to face. In a retrospective approach, which is really what you're doing when you're looking at your critical incident, we're considering alternatives with the benefit of hindsight. But we're still looking at alternatives. We're not just looking at what we've actually done, we're scrutinizing that. And the third way is really contemporaneous, so in the present way of looking at alternatives and reflecting on our practice. Now, linking into the idea of the contemporary or contemporaneous approach, you may have come across the expression critical friends. Costa and Kallick wrote about that a long time ago, but it's still really present. At the moment, I'm involved in a professional development project in the Churchill cluster of schools, which is looking at, in fact, it's kind of a reflective practice in itself because it's looking at students' attitudes, skills and knowledge and developing that. And each time we meet with all the teachers who are in that cluster, we have a critical friend. So a critical friend provides feedback. And as we know, explicit and constructive feedback is, thanks Hattie, is a high impact factor to effective learning. And a critical friend provides such feedback to an individual, whether it's a student or a teacher or an administrator, or it could be even a whole group. But the idea is that we're getting feedback and we're seeking feedback from someone who's being critical and drawing our attention to things that we can work on to make it even better. A critical friend is a trusted person who asks provocative questions and provides data to be examined through another lens. So lending us another perspective, another alternative, offers critique of a person's work as a friend. And it works off the presumption or the assumption that this critical friend takes the time to fully understand the context of the work and the outcomes that the person or the group is working towards. And you've got a link there to this very article written by Costa and Kallick a long time ago, but still really relevant. Critical friends, the format of this approach, which is a collaborative and collegial approach, is in a conference format where the learner first describes a practice and requests feedback. So a teacher might describe a new problem-solving technique, student might describe a project that's been considered, and a critical friend asks questions in order to understand the practice described to clarify the context which frames this example. So a friend might ask the learner, how much time did you allow for the students to do the problem solving, or what do you hope other people will learn from your project? The learner sets the desired outcomes for the conference, which allows the learner to be in control of the feedback. And the critical friend provides feedback about what seems significant about the practice. Feedback provides more than just praise, and certainly again, if we look at feedback again, actually Hattie has written about feedback as well, in the different types of feedback that we use and what's more constructive and compared to others. And so has Timperley, they co-wrote an article on feedback, which is really quite interesting and informative. And certainly just praise, if it's general, is not very helpful in the slightest. So relevant and critical and significant feedback provides a lens that helps the person seeking the feedback to elevate their work. A teacher's critical friend might say, I think it's significant that you're asking students to do problem solving because it will help them become more self-directed. Student's critical friend might say, I think your project will be significant because you're trying to bring a new insight into the way people have understood the changing role of women in the United States. Obviously, this is actually taken straight from the Costa and Kalik article, so I'm not taking credit for this at all. The critical friend also raises questions and critiques the work by nudging the learner to see the project from different perspectives. So it might be, what sort of evidence from your students' work indicate to you about their capacity to do problem solving? And when you do this project, how will you help others follow your presentation? Both participants, so both the critical friend and the critical friend who's being reviewed, reflect and write, and the learner writes notes on the conference, and it's an opportunity for them to think of points and suggestions raised. And the critical friend writes to the learner with suggestions or advice that's meant obviously to be appropriate for that particular outcome that they're seeking feedback on. Now, in this respect, this part of the process is quite different from normal feedback situations because the learner doesn't necessarily have to respond or make the decisions on the basis of the feedback. Instead, the learner reflects on that feedback, and they don't need to defend the work to their critical friend. It's just there as a prompt to reflect further. So it's not formative feedback in that sense, in that you're assuming that there's going to be another step where they act on that feedback. Let me just see if I went on to. Yeah, okay. So what makes a good critical friend? Well, a critical friend who's effective is someone whom you can trust and respect, whom you have a strong relationship with or believe that you could develop a relationship with. So this might be a mentor teacher, it might be a colleague in a setting, it might be a fellow student in the same course as you're in. Provides honest and critical feedback, is a skilled observer and listener, and is able to ask provocative questions that really draw out and stretch the learner, because it's not an exercise in just being comfortable, it's an exercise in really engaging in some reflection. An effective critical friend provides a balance between support and challenge, and understands you and the school context very well, or takes the time to develop this understanding. So time is important in that respect. It provides a different perspective on new eyes and provides critique utilising higher order thinking, and is available. You've got a link there to a toolkit actually from the Queensland Studies Authority, which is quite helpful. It's mainly written for principals and school leaders, but nevertheless the idea of a critical friend is equally applicable, and certainly it's one of these techniques that's being rolled out more and more and more, and it's part of performance reviews, etc., for teachers to share practice and develop one's practice through getting feedback from colleagues. There's a basic protocol that should be followed. Obviously what's said is confidential, and it's important that it's kept confidential. The critical aspect relates to the task, and the friend relates to the person. And the comments should be seen as professional challenges and not criticisms. Expectations of each other with regard to when this is going to happen, so availability, commitment to the process, and reliability on how to go forward needs to be evaluated, and it needs to be discussed and agreed. It cannot be assumed. And you need to own the agenda so that you can make or take responsibility and prepare and follow up. And that goes for both parties. There needs to be an openness to discussion about performance, which is really important because you're seeking to improve something. And certainly if you're in some sort of leadership position, obviously it's an idea that you're helping develop practice in that particular context, and that is also applicable to you as a normal teacher. It's an agreed process for exploring any conflict, and it needs to be discussed at the onset or outset of the process. It's a simple critical friend agreement, and it can make really clear expectations and responsibilities, set out from the very beginning, so we know what we're expecting, and it just makes it a lot more easy to manage. Now, the idea of both critical friends is, as I said, really similar to peer feedback, and peer observation is a really common approach, a common strategy for developing one's practice. Now, on this page, you've got a reproducible worksheet from Dylan William and Siobhan Lee in a recent book, which I happen to be a big fan of, called Embedding Formative Assessment. They've got some really practical tools. And they talk about ABC feedback, which is something we can use as a feedback sandwich and scaffold with our students as a feedback protocol. It's something we can use with our colleagues. It's something we can use with our peers. ABC feedback identifies something you agree with, so you highlight areas where you think, yeah, that's really good, that's strong. B is to build on, so we make some explicit suggestions to strengthen an item. It might be, if it's a written piece, it might be to strengthen the argument, or it might be to strengthen a particular use of or a particular aspect of your teacher's practice. So it might be your voice projection, or it might be your use of questioning and wait time as you're teaching. So it's you making some explicit suggestions for how to strengthen whatever it is that's being assessed by the peer. And C stands for challenge, where we make suggestions for additions or even more substantial developments. So it's very much identifying some good things and some things to work on, which is what feedback that's helpful and effective does. Now, on this peer observation sheet, which is just there, you've got it developed in a structure, so there would be a class that's observed, so you're teaching a lesson and a colleague would watch you. We've got the peer's name, the techniques of this explicit thing that this peer is observing, which is very similar again to the idea of a critical friend and putting forward what point you're seeking feedback on. This particular observation sheet is actually was developed for teachers who are seeking to develop their formative assessment strategies and their formative assessment within teaching. So it's using a particular technique in that landscape, if you like, but it applies to anything. So what do they want the peer to comment on? Again, you're articulating what you seek feedback on, and then the peer makes the comments. Once you've read those, you as the receiver reflect on, okay, what do you take away from this? And you talk through the observations. It's really similar to that protocol I just spoke about in regard to critical friends. And then again, the person who's received the feedback, who's being observed, thinks, okay, what am I going to do next? And that's a formative aspect in respect to how am I going to use this to develop my practice further. task this week. Now, I'm actually going to get you or encourage you to put critical friends and peer feedback into practice. I would like you to use this week's forum to articulate one aspect that you would like feedback on from a critical peer. So you will need to buddy up by using the forum to say, okay, I'd like a peer to give me feedback. And you will probably need to exchange your email addresses because I don't think you have those automatically. I'm not sure how Moodle works in that respect. And I would encourage you to seek feedback on your first assessment draft for this subject, which is due pretty soon anyway. But you would need to articulate what you're seeking feedback on and then get your peer to use that feedback. You might use the type of sheet from Dylan William. You can actually just click on it from the slides, or if you want to use some other format, you can. But the idea is that you're seeking feedback, but you need to articulate what you want feedback on. And then I would encourage you to use ABC feedback comments. You're going to provide feedback to your buddy on the aspect that they've identified as wanting feedback on, and then it's up to them to decide what they do with it. So the different types of reflection, as you are familiar with, a lot of you probably have the Churchill and a whole group of authors textbook because it's been used in a number of subjects, which is why it's quite helpful to have a reference to it here as well. They discuss different types of reflection and propose that there is a developmental continuum of reflective practices, with the ultimate type being one on reflecting in action. And teachers who critically reflective focus their attention both inwardly at their own practice and then also outwardly at the social conditions in which these practices are situated. And critically reflective action helps teachers make informed decisions and develop a rationale for practice, avoid self-laceration, grounds them emotionally, and enlivens classroom, etc., etc. Endless benefits. And the idea of, starting from yourself and then looking outward brings us quite nicely as a little segue to question how we meet the needs of diverse students, which is the other focal point of this week. And it's pretty good timing because I'm not sure if you were aware of it, but between the 12th and 20th of March, so this week, is Cultural Diversity Week in Victoria. And you've got a live link there to multicultural resources, and there's a resource kit for schools, which actually has got quite a lot of good activities. Some of these kits we get sometimes are pretty dodgy, but that's not a bad one. In respect to cultural diversity, and when I'm talking about diversity this week, I'm going to be both speaking briefly about cultural diversity and also inclusivity and special needs and diversity in that respect. But if we're looking at cultural diversity, Victoria is actually one of the most multicultural places in the world. At the 2011 census, the population of Victoria, the total population was 5 million, well, you can see the numbers. But out of those 5.3 million people, 26.2% were born overseas. More than 200 countries represented. So we have a rich context we find ourselves with really diverse students that obviously need to be made welcome and use education as an enriching aspect in their lives. Nearly half of all Victorians were born overseas or had at least one parent who was born overseas. 23.1% of Victorians indicated that they spoke one of 260 languages other than English at home. And the population in Victoria has grown quite rapidly. Approximately 60% of the growth in population was gained through net overseas migration. Migrants, whether they've come by choice or necessity, as refugees for example, make a really significant contribution to Victoria's economic, social and cultural fabric, and we are a nation of migrants. Since the Second World War, over 7.5 million people have made Australia their home, and this is something that's really kind of a bit of background to the cultural diversity we find ourselves in, that schools need to reflect and celebrate. And in fact, this week is an example of that celebration. And it leads into Harmony Day, which is again a resource, or not resource, it's an event in the calendar that celebrates diversity. And there's some really good ideas actually through that link. I've made a little kind of screenshot in how we can incorporate it, but I'm going to click on the link and you should actually be able, to see that there's a whole lot we're looking at. This is just the primary, there's a secondary one as well, looking at English, whole lot of different activities that you obviously don't just use during 1 week, but that you can connect and integrate as part of your planning, your ongoing things. You've got some good resources there as well. Languages, arts, there's a big focus in that teacher resource kit from Victoria on music, and some of it is a bit trivial and kind of tokenistic. So just be mindful, again, that reflective practice. Science, history, geography, health and PE, maths, values, civic citizenship. There's a whole lot of stuff there for you to look at, to tap into as a resource. And again, the idea of integrating this into our everyday practice as teachers to cater for our rich and wonderful fabric of students. This should have worked. It's not working. Why is it not working? Okay, right, it is working now. If we're looking at the other aspect of diversity and inclusion, looking at diverse students with special needs is another aspect that we also are looking at this week. Classrooms are populated with a really diverse group of students and needs, and they're very much integrated into our mainstream, as you know from having been out on placements. Summit of Inclusive Education from 2002 defined inclusive education as a process of responding to the uniqueness of individuals, increasing their presence, access, participation and achievement in a learning society. And in the context of Victoria, we've got more than 570,000 students in more than 1,500 government schools represented. So we have a really strong and vibrant education system that celebrates diversity and is committed to supporting the achievement and the participation of all students. The department, because this is from departmental information, is really committed to delivering an inclusive education system that ensures that all students have access to quality education, and the same goes for Catholic schools and independent schools of other religions or no religion. It is very much across the board or across the spectrum commitment to make sure that we have an inclusive education system. So what do we mean then when we talk about students with additional learning needs? Well, in general, these are the things, and it varies a little bit depending on what jurisdiction you're looking at, certainly in respect to the order of categories, etc., etc. I had a look at some Queensland resources as well. Anyway, this is taken from the Victorian Department, which separates additional learning needs into these program categories. And you can follow, I thought I included a link there, but obviously I haven't. Physical disability, visual impairments, hearing impairments, and there's a whole substrand which kind of articulates the criteria within these categories. Severe behavioural disorders, intellectual disability, autism spectrum disorders, and then also severe language disorders with critical education needs. And those last ones are not eligible for support under the Programme for Students with Disabilities, but should be supported under the Language Support Programme. Ultimately, because you're not principals, it doesn't really matter because you're not filling in these forms, but you're catering for these students, and part of your role as a professional teacher is to make sure that you're actually really seeking to deliver the best possible education for all your students, whether they have any of these learning needs or whether they're from a cultural background or not. So who are we including? What are we doing and how are we doing it? Well, the disability standards apply to all students with a disability, not just those eligible for support under the Programme for Students with Disabilities. And incidentally, there's been some press about this quite recently. On the weekend, in the Week in Australian, on the very front page, it said that 1 in 20 students are actually categorized as having a disability. And then it went on to a whole article about the funding complications, etc., etc. That's another story. I just thought I'd share that with you. So the adjustments that we put in place for these students may involve a combination of addressing physical barriers and including modifications to ensure access, modifying programs and adapting curriculum delivery and assessment strategies, which is really where you come in, because you're probably not going to be out there building ramps, providing ongoing consultancy support or professional learning. Well, you're probably more a recipient of that, but having said that, as part of a collegial practice, you might use that as a reflective and observation part with a colleague to get some feedback and develop your practice in respect to certain students. It might well be something you'd focus on as part of your ongoing learning in a more informal way. Specialised technology or computer software or equipment is another adjustment that can be made. Provision of study notes or research materials in different formats. I used to have to write on the board with a blue marker, for example, and other times I've had to make photocopies on blue paper because I had a student with Erland syndrome, for example. And that wasn't even a formal disability, it was just catering for those needs. Services like sign language interpreters, visiting school teams and specialist support staff can also provide us with suggestions for adjustments and to assess those adjustments. Additional personnel such as tutors or aides for personal care and mobility assistance. Again, this is something that the principal would fill in the forms and apply for funds, so you as a teacher wouldn't do it, but you would certainly work with these people if they're present at the school in order to make sure that the learning is meaningful for your student. The objectives of the program for students with disabilities is obviously to support learning. Well, that's hardly a surprise. And we support and improve the learning of students. We use key performance indicators like it used to be Oswell's, now we're looking at the Victorian curriculum framework, NAPLAN, as an indication of how they're travelling, and also school-based assessment. So a lot of these summative assessments there, but certainly we're using formative aspects as well. Student engagement and well-being is another key objective for this and every student, to support the access and participation of students in an inclusive schooling system. And key performance indicators include attendance, retention, student school satisfaction surveys, and those same indicators are used for all students, certainly if we're looking at a systematic level. Student pathways and transitions, we're supporting students into, through and post school, and again the key performance indicators there include attendance, retention and on-track data, which is generated by the schools. It's not something we as teachers develop. There are student support groups, which is a mandatory to have at a school to help, again, cater for these diverse students' needs. Student support group is central to making an application under the Programme for Students with Disabilities, and the student support group is a cooperative partnership between the parent or guardian or carer, school representatives and professionals to ensure that coordinated support is put in place for the educational needs. As a teacher, I would be part of that as well. For example, the school I was working at, we had individual development plans which was set out for students, and some of them were students with disabilities, some of them just needed individual learning plans, but certainly this is something you're putting in place together as a cooperative partnership. The responsibility of the student support group is to identify students' learning and support needs, gather and review evidence to determine any adjustments that need to be made, and you as a teacher have a role in this, in identifying and gathering data to feed into these reports, to provide advice and guidance on appropriate educational programs and undertake personalised learning and support and planning for the student. Well, obviously you do that as a teacher. You discuss planning with colleagues, with teachers, to provide support. And you provide advice to the principal concerning any educational additional needs. So that's, again, you're being sought, particularly when they're funding times and when a lot of this paperwork needs to be generated. You will be asked to do your bit, if you like, and provide evidence. But there's still the idea of, okay, these are some of the things we're looking at. That should inform your teaching. It should inform your planning. And you have a hyperlink there about information about student support groups where you can get some more information. And there's also a whole host of websites. I've just copied them in, so I haven't actually tried every single one there. So I don't know that they're all live, but hopefully they are. That we can also use as we seek to cater for these students. And that's pretty much it. So a little take-home message. Remember that use the forum this week to seek a buddy and to say, okay, I'm going to want you to provide me feedback on this particular thing. So you're articulating an aspect that you want feedback on in respect to your draft, and then you're getting feedback from your buddy and you're providing feedback to your buddy as well. It's a voluntary thing, so I'm not saying you have to do it, but I would encourage you to put it into practice as a collaborative and collegial person, reflecting on your practice or reflecting on your learning in respect to this assessment task. And that's it. Thank you very much.